Hey there, ready for another deep dive? Today, we're tackling a topic that's, well, it's complex and it's really important. Racial prejudice. We're going to explore how this deeply rooted prejudice, you know how it actually prevents us from achieving true unity. And get this, we'll be uncovering how a religion, that is, like all about unity, the Baha'i faith, has had its own surprising struggles with, you guessed it, prejudice.
Especially within its Western communities.
It really highlights how ingrained these biases are, even in places where you would least expect them, I think. It's not just about understanding prejudice, but recognizing its more subtle forms and how those forms can have...
With source, not operants.
Exactly.
Okay, so our sources, they jump right into the psychology behind all of this.
Yeah.
And fascinating. They talk about how so much of prejudice actually operates beneath the surface, shaped by centuries of inequality and cultural narratives. Like, did you know that colonialism and slavery played a huge part in creating this sense of racial hierarchy that we still see in the West today? Yeah. It's almost like it gets woven into our cultural DNA. Even if we consciously disagree with those ideas, they can linger in our subconscious. It's what psychologists call cognitive dissonance.
Cognitive dissonance.
It's deep, that uncomfortable feeling you get when your beliefs clash with your actions, or when you hold two contradictory ideas. At the same time, think about it. We say we believe in equality, but then we might unconsciously clutch our bags a little tighter when we see a certain type of person walk by. That mental discomfort is cognitive dissonance in action.
Wow. That makes so much sense. So how do we deal with that discomfort?
Our sources suggest that. Sometimes, instead of confronting those biases, we try to rationalize them, which it can lead to some pretty twisted mental gymnastics, like blaming societal problems on certain groups or finding ways to justify discrimination.
It's almost like our brains are trying to protect us from facing uncomfortable truths about ourselves.
Right, exactly. And then there's this other fascinating psychological aspect that our sources bring up. The superiority complex, apparently. Feeling superior to others can be a way to mask our own insecurities or failures. It's easier to look down on others and blame them for their situation than it is to acknowledge our own flaws or the systemic issues at play.
Oh, that's so interesting. It's almost like prejudice becomes a defense mechanism, a way to boost our own egos while avoiding any real self-reflection.
Right, and then there's the age-old fear of the other, which is such a powerful driver of prejudice. It's rooted in that primal fear of losing what we have, power, stability, even our sense of identity.
So you're saying fears like losing cultural dominance or economic security can actually manifest as these subtle biases that prevent us from achieving true unity.
Absolutely. Fear can be a powerful motivator. And unfortunately, it can be easily manipulated to create divisions and distrust between groups.
Okay, so we've got these deeply rooted psychological factors at play, but our sources. They also highlight how societal structures maintain and even amplify prejudice. They talk about things like structural inequalities, unequal access to education, healthcare, and economic opportunities. Like, even if we have the best intentions, we might be unknowingly supporting systems that give certain groups an advantage over others.
And those inequalities breed division and resentment. Think about it. When you see one group consistently having better access to resources and opportunities, it's easy to fall into the trap of stereotypes and assumptions. The sources also point to the impact of cultural dominance, where one culture sets the standard for what's considered normal or acceptable, often marginalizing other traditions in the process.
That's such a good point. It creates this invisible hierarchy that makes true collaboration and respect nearly impossible. It's like we're constantly being bombarded with messages that reinforce these power dynamics, often without even realizing it.
And then you have the echo chamber effect, where our social circles and the information we consume trap us in these bubbles that just confirm our existing biases. If we're not actively seeking out diverse perspectives, we risk becoming more entrenched in our own limited worldview. It's like we're being nudged toward confirmation bias without even knowing it.
That's a bit scary, isn't it? It makes you wonder how much control we actually have over our own perceptions and beliefs.
It's definitely something to be aware of. Now, shifting gears a bit, the sources, they also delve into the economic dimensions of prejudice, which I found really eye-opening. They discuss how economic disparities often go hand in hand with racial tensions.
Yeah, it's like wealth and privilege tend to be concentrated within certain racial groups, which can lead to all sorts of skewed judgments about people's worth.
It's as though wealth and race become intertwined in our minds, leading us to make assumptions about people's abilities and character based solely on their economic status. The sources call this class prejudice. It's the idea that economic privilege, when it overlaps with racial identity, feeds this unspoken assumption that success is somehow tied to inherent merit or worth, which is a dangerous oversimplification.
It's like we're judging people based on their circumstances,
Yeah.
rather than seeing them as individuals with their own unique strengths and challenges.
Exactly. And this prejudice can then be used to justify all sorts of economic injustice. Things like exploitative labor practices, unequal pay,
Yeah.
and limited access to opportunities.
It's almost like prejudice becomes a shield for those in power, allowing them to maintain the status quo without addressing the root causes of inequality.
And it's not always about overt exploitation either. The sources also challenge this concept of charitable superiority,
Right.
where seemingly good intentions can actually reinforce a power dynamic. Those situations where the giver feels benevolent, but the receiver might feel patronized or even dehumanized.
Yeah, I see what you mean. It's like those helping hands can sometimes
Yeah.
end up pushing people further down instead of
Yeah.
lifting them up.
Exactly. It's a reminder that even our best efforts can backfire if we're not carefully considering the perspectives and needs of those we're trying to help. Now, here's where things get really interesting. Our sources shift their focus to the Baha'i faith, which, as we mentioned earlier, is a religion that centers on unity. What's fascinating is that even within this faith, particularly in its Western branches, there's been a struggle with racial prejudice.
It's surprising, right? You'd think a religion so focused on unity wouldn't have these issues. So how did this happen?
Well, the sources suggest that even teachings on unity can be misinterpreted or misused. They can be twisted to silence dissenting voices, or to justify one culture's dominance over another. It's like this facade of unity that masks deeper divisions and avoids the real work that needs to be done.
It's like putting a Band-Aid on a broken bone. It might look okay on the surface, but it's not actually addressing the underlying problem.
Exactly, and that's what the sources call superficial unity. It's that surface-level harmony. That doesn't actually address the root causes of prejudice. It's about avoiding those tough conversations and sweeping things under the rug instead of acknowledging the problem and actively working towards solutions. And this brings us to a crucial point: personal responsibility.
Okay, I'm ready for some actionable advice. How do we actually start to uproot prejudice?
Well, the sources emphasize that. We can't just sit back and think prejudice is someone else's problem to solve. We all have a part to play. And it starts with self-reflection. We need to be willing to examine our own thoughts, behaviors, and assumptions, with humility and a willingness to face some hard truths about ourselves. Remember that feeling of cognitive dissonance we talked about earlier? Well,
Yeah.
recognizing those moments of discomfort is key to starting that process of self-reflection.
So instead of trying to rationalize those uncomfortable feelings, we need to lean into them and use them as opportunities for growth.
Right. Exactly. And along with self-reflection, the sources highlight the importance of education. Understanding the historical and structural roots of racial inequality is crucial for dismantling those deeply ingrained stereotypes and cultivating genuine empathy.
It's like once you understand the historical context
Yeah.
and how these systems of oppression were created and maintained, you start to see the world through a completely different lens. It's a lot harder to hold on to those prejudiced beliefs
Yeah.
when you understand the real human cost of those beliefs.
Absolutely. And that brings us to a concept that's particularly relevant in the context of the Baha'i faith, which is
Yeah.
inclusive consultation.
Tell me more about that. How does consultation help to combat prejudice?
Well, imagine a table where everyone has a seat and everyone's voice is valued equally. That's the essence of inclusive consultation. It's about actively seeking out diverse perspectives, creating safe spaces for marginalized voices to be heard, and challenging those dominant cultural norms that often silence those voices.
So, it's not just about listening. It's about truly considering those different perspectives.
And allowing them to shape our understanding of the world.
Exactly. It's a two-way street, and on a practical level, it could look like making a conscious effort to diversify your social circles, seeking out information from sources that represent a range of viewpoints, or supporting organizations that are working to empower marginalized communities.
That makes a lot of sense. It's about actively breaking out of those echo chambers we were talking about earlier.
Right. And of course, we can't forget about the importance of economic justice. Addressing economic disparities is crucial for dismantling those systems that perpetuate prejudice. When certain groups are consistently disadvantaged economically, it creates a breeding ground for resentment, reinforces harmful stereotypes, and makes it nearly impossible to achieve true equality.
So what can we do to promote economic justice? I mean,
Yeah.
It seems like such a huge systemic issue. Where do we even begin? It might feel overwhelming, But even small actions can make a difference. Supporting businesses owned by people of color, advocating for policies that promote economic equity, and donating to organizations that are working to address poverty and inequality are all ways to contribute to a more just economic system.
It's about using our resources and our voices to create a world where everyone has the opportunity to thrive, regardless of their background or the color of their skin.
Exactly. And it's not just about external actions either. Our sources also remind us that overcoming prejudice requires internal transformation. They emphasize the role of spiritual practices, like prayer and meditation, in cultivating qualities like humility, compassion, and detachment.
That's interesting. How do those spiritual practices actually help us combat prejudice?
Well, think about it. Humility helps us to recognize that we don't have all the answers, that our perspective is limited, and that we have a lot to learn from others. Compassion allows us to connect with the shared humanity of all people, regardless of their differences. And detachment helps us to let go of our ego, our need to be right, and our attachment to those ingrained biases that prevent us from seeing the world clearly.
It's like we're clearing out the weeds in our own minds to make space for something more beautiful to grow.
That's a great analogy, in fact. Our sources actually use a gardening metaphor to describe the process of overcoming prejudice. They say it's like tending to the garden of our hearts and minds, constantly weeding out those seeds of prejudice and cultivating the flowers of unity and compassion.
I love that image. It reminds us that this isn't a one-time fix. It's an ongoing process, a daily practice of awareness, intention, and action.
Exactly. Just like a garden needs regular care and attention to flourish, so too does our journey towards a more just and equitable world.
It's about recognizing that prejudice can manifest in subtle ways, even in the best of intentions. It's about constantly questioning our assumptions, being open to learning and growing, and having the courage to challenge ourselves and those around us when we see prejudice taking root.
And that's where the concept of detachment becomes so important. It's about letting go of our attachment to those ingrained biases and embracing a more expansive worldview, a worldview that recognizes the inherent oneness of humanity, just like the Baha'i teachings emphasize.
So how do we actually cultivate that sense of detachment? I mean,
Sure.
It's easy to say, let go of your biases, but how do we actually do that in a practical sense?
It's a process, and it starts with awareness. The more we become aware of our own biases, the more we can start to loosen their grip on our thoughts and behaviors. Practices like mindfulness and meditation can help us to develop that awareness.
It's like we're training our minds to notice those moments when prejudice arises so that we can choose a different path, a path that leads to understanding, compassion.
In unity. Exactly. And it's important to remember that we're not alone in this journey. We're all in this together. And we can learn from and support each other along the way.
It's like we're all tending to this collective garden, each of us playing our part in creating a more beautiful and just world.
I love that. And that brings us back to the challenge of achieving unity, even within a faith that's explicitly dedicated to that principle.
It really is a microcosm of the larger societal struggle, isn't it? Even in a community that strives for inclusivity, those deeply embedded prejudices can still surface.
It highlights the insidious nature of prejudice and the need for constant vigilance, even in the most well-intentioned spaces. It's a reminder that the work of dismantling prejudice is never truly finished. It's an ongoing process that requires sustained effort and commitment from each of us.
It's like, even when we think we've made progress, there's always more work to be done, more layers to peel back, more seeds of prejudice to uproot.
It's a humbling realization, and it speaks to the importance of approaching this work with both urgency and patience. Urgency, because the consequences of inaction are so profound, and patience, because real lasting change takes time and sustained effort.
It's like we're running a marathon, not a sprint, but that doesn't mean we can just coast along. We have to keep pushing forward, challenging ourselves and each other, and never losing sight of that vision of a more just and unified world.
Absolutely. And to that point, I think it's worth highlighting one of the most practical and insightful takeaways from our sources, the emphasis on education, consultation, and action as a framework for dismantling prejudice.
Okay, break that down for me. How do those three elements work together?
Well, think of it as a three-pronged approach. First, we educate ourselves. We learn about the historical and systemic roots of racial prejudice, understanding how these systems of oppression were created and maintained, how they continue to impact our lives today, and how our own implicit biases might be playing a role.
So, education's like laying the foundation, giving us the knowledge and context we need to really understand the complexity of the issue.
Exactly. Then comes consultation. We engage in open and honest dialogue with people from diverse backgrounds, actively seeking out perspectives that challenge our own assumptions and broaden our understanding of the world.
It's about recognizing that we don't have all the answers, that our own experiences and perspectives are limited, and that we have so much to learn from others.
Right. It's about creating those spaces where everyone feels safe to share their thoughts and experiences, where we can listen deeply to each other and learn from each other's stories.
And it's not just about passive listening, right? It's about using those conversations to challenge our own biases, to ask ourselves tough questions, and to be willing to change our minds.
Exactly. And that leads us to the final element, action. We take what we've learned through education and consultation, and we put it into practice in our daily lives.
What does that look like in a practical sense?
It could be anything from speaking out against prejudice when you see it happening, to supporting organizations that are working to promote racial justice. It could be making a conscious effort to diversify your social circles, seeking out information from sources that represent a range of viewpoints, or simply being more mindful of your own language and behaviors.
It's about taking those small, everyday actions that, when multiplied by millions of people, can create a ripple effect of positive change.
Exactly. And it's about recognizing that we all have a role to play in this work, no matter how big or small. Every action, every conversation, every moment of self-reflection brings us one step closer to that vision of a world where everyone can live in peace and harmony.
You know, as you're talking, I keep thinking back to that example of the Baha'i faith and its own internal struggle with prejudice. It's such a powerful reminder that this work is never truly finished, even in a community that's explicitly dedicated to unity and justice. Those deeply embedded prejudices can still surface.
It's a humbling reminder that we're all susceptible to these biases, no matter how enlightened or well-intentioned we might think we are. And it underscores the need for constant vigilance, for ongoing self-reflection, and for a deep commitment to the principles of unity, justice, and love.
It's like tending that garden of our hearts and minds, day after day, year after year, never letting our guard down, always striving to create a more beautiful and just world.
And I think that's a perfect note to end on. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. We hope it's given you some food for thought and inspired you to continue this vital work in your own lives and communities.
Remember, even small acts of kindness and understanding can make a difference. Keep learning. Keep questioning, keep challenging yourself, and keep striving for that world where everyone can flourish.
Until next time, keep diving deep.